Well, I mean, let's go ahead and get an update. It seems as though these joint patrols have been suspended right now due to some rebel action in the region. So we see how tenuous the situation is, and it really is an hour-to-hour or minute-by-minute matter. On the one hand, this was seen as a trust-building exercise between Turkey and Russia, who've had a rather tenuous situation over Idlib. And even when they have then been able to broker some kind of a rapprochement to dial back the tensions between Ankara and Moscow, we find that the situation on the ground is so fluid that even those efforts that are being made between the two countries to have that kind of joint patrolling on the ground is being frustrated.
Indeed, I was going to ask about some of the challenges. We know that there are groups that have been opposed, for example, to Russian involvement. Full stop. Obviously, we don't know who's been involved in these protests, perhaps attacks that, as you've mentioned, have triggered the patrols to stop. But talk about some of the challenges that even having a joint patrol along that M4 highway would present.
Well, again, as we said, Roee, that there are several parties that have their own vested interests in seeing an instability in the region. If there was some kind of promise or hope that everybody would want to have some kind of more stable Syria, then we could go ahead and move toward what the United Nations is planning with its negotiations. Another example we find is happening in really the birthplace of the Arab Spring in Syria, and that is Daraa. Daraa was the site of the 2011 protests, which then led to the troubles in Syria over the last 9, coming on 10 years. There was supposed to be a ceasefire there with the opposition group between the Assad regime and the rebels, and even that is something that has not been able to be stabilized. There are over 200 casualties even there, a mixture of Assad forces as well as rebel forces, as well as external forces coming in to do the fighting. And I think this is one of the main things that we have to understand, which is a sad legacy as Syria approaches its second decade of conflict, that it is really the killing fields of a proxy war by so many external forces that are working within the region, both to go ahead and support and to oust the regime, but mostly for their own self-interest and broader regional and geopolitical interests.
And, you know, speaking of these proxy wars, just recently Turkey and Russia were close to a full-out war themselves. What changed and how?
Well, both of these countries recognize that Syria is probably not the proverbial hill upon which either of them wants to die. Second of all, Turkey and Russia have very strong ties commercially through their energy needs. We have gas pipelines that Ankara and Moscow both have that go through Turkey and that supply Europe. That is perhaps the paramount priority for both countries, in which they see that if they were having tensions or, let's face it, even an all-out war between the two, that would then destroy any plans that they would have to both benefit and profit from those ventures. So I think that cooler heads did prevail in this matter, and I think that we've seen examples where they have in the past, when Turkey shot down a Russian fighter jet ostensibly over Turkish airspace a few years ago. Again, one would have thought that this was a moment of tremendous consternation, that this would escalate into perhaps a war between the two countries, and yet we find that both Prime Minister or President Erdogan as well as Prime Minister Putin were able to scale it back.
Saeed, how long before the Syrian people see some relief? I mean, this is now the 10th year of this conflict.
I'm afraid there's nothing in the imminent future, Roee, to indicate that there's going to be any kind of relief for them. We have to understand that here's a country of a population of 23 million. Exactly half of that has been displaced, 6 million internally, another 6.5 to 7 million worldwide. And the effort and the effect that it is having on the neighbors. Obviously, Turkey has taken in 3.6 million, and now, as was reported, has said that we will no longer try to inhibit them from crossing into Europe through Greece. The other neighbor is Lebanon, which a country of 4 million has absorbed another 1 million refugees. It is having quite a tremendous financial crisis at this point. Jordan is similarly poorly situated to absorb refugees with its economic situation. So we find that the ripple effects of this are certainly well beyond the borders of Syria. It will take a multilateral effort on all of these parties, both neighbors as well as other external forces, to try to find some peace. And of course, the main linchpin here is Assad. He has to go ahead and yield to some kind of compromise